Now, I'd like to introduce to you the speakers. I will introduce all of those who are on the affirmative as a group and ask you to welcome them, then I'll deal with all of those on the negative. The first speaker tonight for the affirmative is Matthew Evans, a former chef and a food critic who's turned Tasmanian smallholder. He fattens pigs, he milks a cow, tends a garden and writes about food from his office atop his cottage on Puggle Farm in the gorgeous Huon Valley. Matthew's the author of 9 books on food and writes regularly for Feast magazine. At the moment, he's setting up a 70-acre piece of land as a mixed farm under the name Fat Pig Farm, specialising in old and rare breed pork. He recently finished filming the latest in the SBS television series Gourmet Farmer, which will air on SBS on the 14th of March. Matthew's other project is A Common Ground, an artisan Tasmanian food store he co-owns with Nick Haddo, which also specialises in regional produce events. Speaking second is Katy Barfield, who was CEO of SecondBite from 2006 until 2012. Together with founders Ian and Simone Carson, Katy led SecondBite from collecting around 600 kilograms of fresh produce in 2005 to redistributing over 2 million kilograms in 2012. She's now established Spade and Barrow, a social business that aims to purchase nature's grade produce, and she says here to think of wonky carrots and pink lady apples that are slightly the wrong side of pink, and to distribute these wholesale to the public sector, food enterprises and community organisations. Her aim is to put value back into the food system by compensating farmers fairly for fabulous fresh produce that would otherwise not be harvested, whilst providing affordable, fresh, nutritious food wholesale to the public and community sector. Katy was awarded the Tattersalls Enterprise and Achievement Award in July 2008, was selected by The Age as one of Melbourne's 100 most influential people. In 2011, Katy was awarded the Stanford Australia Foundation Scholarship for Not-for-Profit Leaders and completed Stanford University's Executive Program in Social Entrepreneurship. And finally, the third speaker for the affirmative is someone who really doesn't need any introduction from me. It's Wendy Harmer, one of Australia's most successful comedians. Wendy had outstanding success leading 2Day FM's top-rating breakfast radio show in Sydney for 11 years. She's written several books for adults and a best-selling series of books for children about Pearly the Park Fairy. Wendy appeared as host of ABC TV's The Big Gig for 3 years, and she wrote and presented the documentary series Stuff for ABC TV. She's a member of the National People with a Disability and Carers Council, a patron of Interplast. Wendy is the editor-in-chief of The Hoopla, an online news and magazine website. She was a 2009 Celebrity Masterchef contestant and used to cover urban affairs or local government in this very hall and has some interesting stories to tell about what used to occur in the back rooms of this building. So, would you please welcome the speakers for the affirmative? Leading the side for the negative, having battled Melbourne's peak hour traffic and only just arrived, so she's looking a little frayed, that's why, is Alla Wolf-Tasker, executive chef and co-proprietor of Daylesford's Lake House. She has enough national and international awards to fill virtually every wall of her fabled house on the lake. Recent accolades for the restaurant and hotel include listing in Tatler London's top 100 hotels in the world, listing in the Australian Hottest 50 Restaurants and Australia's top hotel dining room for Gourmet Traveller magazine. She's a roving ambassador of sorts, and Alla participates in food festivals all around the world, spreading her message of the importance of reconnecting with our food and its provenance. Amongst Alla's personal awards are the title of Living Legend from the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, so it's her home Living Legend moment just this very week, the Award for Professional Excellence from the Age Good Food Guide, and a Lifetime Achiever Award from Australia's Restaurant and Caterers Association. In 2007, Alla was named a member of the Order of Australia for her services to tourism and hospitality. In 2012, she was given the Age Good Food Guide Legend Award for her contribution to the hospitality industry. She's joined by Richard Cornish, who is not quite yet a legend, but may hope to be one day, on his way, an award-winning writer whose love of the land led him to explore the issues around food, where it comes from, how it gets to us, and why it tastes so good. He's a senior writer for The Age Epicure and the Sydney Morning Herald Good Living, and has co-written 4 books on Spanish food with Movida chef Frank Camora, and also a book on food of Mexico, and is a judge for the Banksia Foundation Awards. He consults to the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival and was cast as the commentator on Iron Chef Australia. And last but not least, having travelled the furthest of all, Fuchsia Dunlop, a British cook and food writer specialising in Chinese cuisine. She was the first Westerner to train in the Sichuan Higher Institute of Cuisine and has been travelling around China collecting recipes for nearly 2 decades. Fuchsia was named Food Journalist of the Year by the British Guild of Food Writers in 2006, won the James Beard Award for Food Culture and Travel in 2012. She writes for the Financial Times, the New Yorker and the Observer, amongst other publications. Her books include the award-winning Sichuan Cookery, Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, and her newly released Every Grain of Rice. Fuchsia speaks, reads and writes Chinese. Would you please welcome all of the speakers for the negative? Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that our food obsession has gone too far. I invite Matthew Evans to address this House with his arguments for the affirmative. Matthew.
Thank you, Simon. And for those who might have noticed, I actually sprained my ankle yesterday and I was limping after chasing a recently born calf through a bumpy paddock in southern Tasmania. I want to address the topic exactly as it's written. Our food obsession has gone too far. And I think by our food obsession, I think generally we're talking about Australia's food obsession, or perhaps the developed world's food obsession, the English-speaking world's food obsession. And I want to suggest that the sentence, by definition, implies that it has gone too far, because the word obsession is a word that you don't associate in a positive light. If I was to say I was obsessed with my ex-girlfriend, most of the people I know would think that's not a good thing. If my partner was obsessed with sports bet, or with body image, or you were obsessed with the bloke who reads the news, those aren't positive connotations. So it's got me wondering about what this word obsessed actually means. And I've got a 3-year-old son, and I was thinking about, if this is a good thing to be obsessed, would I want my son to be obsessed? Would I want him to be obsessed with Jenga, or Angry Birds, or Thomas the Tank Engine, or his hair, or what he puts in his mouth? And the answer is, as any parent will probably tell you, we actually spend our time trying to get our child not to be obsessed with Angry Birds, not to be obsessed with Thomas the Tank Engine. And so last night I thought I'd do a bit of homework. I'd actually look up the definition of obsession, obsessed. And I was going to spend 2 minutes doing it, but I live in the country and we don't have ADSL, so it took me about 20 minutes to actually look up the definition. But I found a couple of the first 2 definitions I found. So one of them is the preoccupation of the mind continually and intrusively and to a troubling extent. So you're preoccupied continually, intrusively, and to a troubling extent. That's not a good thing. An obsession, to be obsessed, is not a good thing. The next definition I looked up is that a compulsive preoccupation with a fixed idea or unwanted feeling or emotion, often accompanied by symptoms of anxiety. So the reason I don't want to teach my child to be obsessed, because I think it's a negative thing to teach someone to be obsessed, and it's a negative thing to have an obsession, is I don't want him to have continual, intrusive and troubling preoccupations. I'd like him to have a healthy interest in playing, a healthy interest in eating something green would be nice, a healthy interest in what he puts in his mouth, perhaps a healthy interest in wearing shorts when it's hot and not walking around naked as he wants to do. But being obsessed isn't like having a healthy interest in food, and I think this is where the distinction is really important. Having a healthy interest in food is a good idea. Knowing where your food comes from, wanting to have something reasonably delicious to eat, and caring a little bit about what you put on the table and who you share it with isn't a bad thing. What we have is an obsession. And I think there's a couple of examples of how you can show that Australia, in particular, has an obsession with food. And I've travelled a fair bit around the world, so if you go to places like China or Thailand or France or Italy or Spain, places that talk about food, that are interested in food, I don't think generally they're obsessed with it. I don't think they have an unhealthy preoccupation, a troubling preoccupation with food like we do. Are we obsessed with food? You can get in Australia a quarter of the population will watch a cooking show. Up to about a quarter of the population of Australia will watch a cooking show where home cooks watch other home cooks attempt restaurant food. That isn't a healthy interest in what goes on your dinner plate, that's an obsession. We sell hundreds of thousands of cookbooks in Australia every year. The average Australian cooks between 2 and 3 recipes out of a cookbook. A recipe book is an instruction manual. It's not a David Moore or Ansel Adams pictorial where you just look at the pretty pictures and dream of taking photos or being there. These are instruction manuals that are attempting to get you to cook something slightly better perhaps or more varied onto your table, breakfast, lunch and dinner. But we don't treat them as that. We obsess about food, we think about food, we talk about food, we want to see it in books, but we're not cooking it. We think of restaurant cooking at home as a way of selling products, as though what people do in restaurants where food is overhandled, has to be prepared ahead of time and is cooked for large numbers of people as something to aspire to. So people will try to create a snow egg at home but possibly not understand how to cook the perfect pasta. And I think the great example of our obsession with food is the fact that we make celebrities out of chefs. And I'm a chef by trade, and I've worked with chefs on and off for the last 30 years since I started my apprenticeship, and I've written about chefs. And look, they're talented, some of them, they're skillful. Most of them are naughty boys and girls. Most of them are either real criminals or culinary criminals, but they're not people you necessarily would put on a pedestal. They might be very good at their job, but so might your plumber or electrician be. The thing is, if you obsess about food, you think of a chef as being a celebrity, when all they've got are the skills that we should all have, which is being able to put something decent, hopefully nutritious, and hopefully delicious on the table. The difference is, you and I don't have to be able to install the fuse box like an electrician, but you and I should be able to know how to cook dinner at home. So I think we are obsessed as a nation. And I think if you were really seriously interested in food and had a healthy interest in food, you would look to the true experts, the Indigenous, the people who grow your food, because I can tell you, having a crack at growing food, you have to know a lot more and have a lot more skills to be able to grow a good carrot than to be able to cook one. And the elderly, this font of knowledge. And instead what we do is we deify chefs of all people instead of the true font of knowledge in society. And that's a sign of our obsession with food as opposed to a healthy interest. So has our obsession benefited us? Has it increased our knowledge of food? Well, we have the best food labelling that we've ever had, more nutrition panels, more ingredient lists, and we make the worst food choices. We have astronomical obesity levels and still increasing, as Katy will attest in a minute. Has it helped to produce more ethical food production, this obsession that we have with food? No. We have more cattle in feedlots, we have more pigs in confinement, we have 520 million chickens produced in Australia every year in an intensive system where you're allowed 40 kilograms of chicken bird in 1 square metre of space in a shed. Now, just picture how many frozen chickens you'd have to have laid out in 1 square metre, and that's frozen chickens. The real live ones have feathers and feet and have to be able to walk around and dream of a dust bath. Being obsessed with food as a nation has not led to the ethical treatment of animals. Do we understand how food is produced better because we're obsessed, because we have all these food shows, because we read all these cooking books, because we talk about food all the time? I suggest no. And the reason, I had a great example yesterday, the lead story on the Age website, your former broadsheet in Melbourne, talked about a man who found a frog in his lettuce. The lead story. He bought a bag of lettuce at a supermarket and said, "This is disgusting. I ate some of this salad. I could die." Die in capitals, exclamation mark. "This poor frog. Wait until the people for ethical treatment of animals hear about this. I feel disgusted, and still hungry." This is not a news story. If you have a healthy interest in food, if you've ever had a garden, and I've got a semi-commercial vegetable garden, if I don't find frogs in my lettuce, there's something wrong. If you've sprayed enough pesticides that you don't find caterpillars, slugs and frogs in your lettuce, there's something wrong. So our obsession with food hasn't led us to being more knowledgeable about how food should be produced. So our increasing obsession has been matched with decreasing health outcomes, decreasing animal welfare, a really poor understanding of how food is produced, and it doesn't seem to have made more home cooks than we've ever had before. 80 years ago, when raw ingredients cost more as a proportion of your weekly budget, more people cooked at home. They had less spare time, it cost them more, and more people cooked. So it's done nothing to increase our health, animal welfare, our understanding and our ability to cook at home. I think our food obsession has obviously gone too far.
So I'm here and we're talking about whether our obsession with food has gone too far. I just want to very quickly, though, say right at the outset that we don't accept Matthew's limiting definition of obsession. There can be healthy and beneficial obsessions. There can also be good obsessions. There can also be great obsessions, and there can be magnificent obsessions. And there is where we would like food to be, for it to be a magnificent obsession. There are obsessions with celebrities, there are obsessions with chefs, there are obsessions with media, hype, all sorts of things. That's not about obsession with food. And in terms of health issues and obesity, countries that have huge proportion of obesity and early onset diabetes are not in love with food. They're not in love with the notion of food or obsessed with food. They're just obsessed with eating. And the US is a perfect example of that. Supersize me is the mantra of all mealtimes. Bring it on, Buster. Give me more. Just bring it on. And of course, it's the country that produces the cheapest food on the planet, has the biggest industrialised food system in the world, and has the largest obesity rate and the largest proportion of early onset diabetes. I don't think that a nation that is truly obsessed with food really has to look like that. That's a nation obsessed with eating. So what should a nation that is truly obsessed with food look like? These are the sort of things that I would put onto the agenda. People living in nations with rich food cultures and who are truly obsessed with food are knowledgeable about their food. They distinguish quality over quantity. They'll walk an extra mile to get something really, really good. They'll save their money and buy a little piece of something wonderful instead of buying a whole lot of something banal and terrible. They care about their palate. They care about the palate education of their children. They respect their farmers and their providors, and they also care enough to be concerned about government policies on food. That's what I would call a nation obsessed with food. And where would you say would we find a utopia of that nature? Because it's certainly not Australia at the moment. And probably if we look around the European countries, there's probably a couple we could pick on, but let's pick on France, for example. Now, the French, for example, long time ago decided that a little bit of the best rather than a whole lot of the worst is what good living was all about, and was certainly what health was all about. And France, in fact, has the lowest rate of heart disease and stroke in the whole world, despite the fact that they eat more dairy than anyone else in the whole world. China is catching up, incidentally. In their search for the best, Parisians will cross the city in search of the best baker or the best butcher. In villages, they'll travel to the next the next village in order to find the best charcuterie. They really are on the search for really the best ingredients and the best food. And regardless of their economic status, they'll save in order to buy the perfect little piece of reblochon or roquefort, some salt marsh lamb, some breast chicken to roast for a special occasion. They adore buttercream and apples from Normandy. They treasure cherries from Limousin, confits from Dordogne. The French don't have celebrity chefs so much, they have celebrity foods. And they know all about these foods and they talk about them. And the interesting thing is that this is not just a middle-class affectation, not at all. If you travel in France, you'd know that if you stopped and talked to a cluster of blue-collar workers or farm labourers and asked them where the best sausage was made in the region, or if you asked them which cafe produced the best regional specialty, Navarine, a daube or a cassoulet, they'd fight with each other over giving you the answer. These are people who care about the food. They have educated palates and they take care in finding the best and the most delicious. By the way, and some of you might know this, relais routiers, the truck and bus stops in France used to be amongst the best places to eat in the whole of France for years and years and years. Imagine us being able to say that about Australia. Mate, you should try our truck stops. The food is awesome. There's a nation obsessed with food. I'm going to read you out a few menus, 3 days' worth of menus from an establishment in Paris. Monday, beetroot salad with croutons, lamb couscous with semolina and vegetables, yoghurt and fruit. Tuesday, grated carrot salad with lemon juice dressing, roast pork with mustard sauce, peas, Gruyere cheese, fromage blanc with fruit and syrup. You're getting the point, I could go on. Where are these menus from, do you think? They're from a school menu in the 4th arrondissement. And you can actually download these menus off the web. Here it is, this is the menus for February. And these are the menus that are fed to children at lunchtime, the most important meal of the day. The French don't need a celebrity chef to tell their schools how to feed their kids. Schools in France are places where you not only learn algebra and geography, but you also learn about the art of living, joie de vivre, les bonnes manières, and also proper appreciation of gustatory delights. By the time children finish school in France, they will have experienced the full spectrum of all the great French cheeses. You think, why is that so important? Well, the reason it's important is they're growing the next generation of consumers for their farmers and providors. This is a critical thing for them, and the varied menus educate the palate so that hopefully those kids will not develop a 3-hamburger-a-day diet like many of our children are in Australia. Interesting meals at a table, given early in life with conversation and conviviality, create habits that really, really are difficult to get rid of. It's important, this dedication to food. And in France, food is at the apex of all of their concerns, and that's what it's about. It's about prioritising what we think is the most important thing in life. Make no mistake, in France, though, they're just as susceptible to marketing as we are, and teenage kids after school will often go off and have a bit of le fast food, and families will get together and binge on cheap hamburgers with American ketchup. And yet, when you travel in France, when you travel in that country, overall, there remains a palpable and generalised sense of resistance to junk, to the sugar-filled, to the mass-produced, a resistance to the processed, the tasteless, and above all, a resistance to the banal. And that brands it as a nation really obsessed with food. Farmers, producers and growers in France are absolutely venerated. They have a real standing in the community. They get grants, they get special subsidies, and you try and take those away, and my Lord, the freeways are blocked for days, there's rotting food pushed up to Parliament House, all the motorways are blocked, there's strikes from everyone, there's all of this stuff in the newspaper about food, and of course France has a Minister for Food. Why are we surprised? It's a nation obsessed with food. A healthy obsession. These behaviours and practices speak volumes about a nation for whom food is at the apex of their priorities. So how do we rate against these benchmark behaviours? If we're trying to say we're too obsessed, I'd say we're not obsessed at all, but if we're having a look at these benchmark behaviours, we of course don't have a formidable ethos of centuries-old food culture, so we have to work a bit harder. We have to work a bit harder against the potential slippage into an industrialised food system. against a reliance on fast and processed foods, and against the constraints that actually conspire to stop us enjoying food. We're all so damn busy, we really can't stop for good food. We have to work harder because we don't have this food culture to get our kids have proper food education, because it's certainly not amongst any of the government policies out there. I know I'm preaching to the converted, but in Australia, I would hazard a guess that for each family that makes shopping at the farmers' markets a social outing, I would hazard a guess that there are thousands and probably hundreds of thousands for whom shopping is just a chore and who shop almost solely at convenience stores, where frozen packaged processed foods make up over 90% of the offer. For many people, family meals are not shared occasions at a dinner table, and of course we all know children consume food in front of the television, in the car and the computer. And mealtimes, what's happened to mealtimes? They're anything but the most important time of the day. They're things one needs to get over and done with before one can go on with something more important and something one is really obsessed with. Think about it. I really need to get this dinner time over with the kids, because really what I want to be doing is X. The food is just something that we do to fuel the family, to fuel ourselves. We're not obsessed with food. There's substantial apathy in Australia about food issues. We don't strike over GMOs or food labelling or treatment of farmers for that matter, nor do we often debate the issues. Our food will not even be a tiny blimp on the radar of the coming federal elections. Yes, there's pockets of good things happening, and yes, I know that amongst you people tonight there's all sorts of wonderful things and activities that you get involved in, and there's some cause for optimism. But it will also always be a question of priorities and choice. But obsessed with food or over-obsessed with food, this nation, nah, we haven't even scratched the surface. Thank you.
Thanks. As Matthew said, I'm going to do a bit of talking about obesity. I'm going to be the official fun sponge of today's proceedings. Because this year in Australia, over 18,000 people will die from diet-related disease. We'll spend $37 billion on fast food. 1.2 million Australians will be food insecure. And we will put 102 million tonnes of CO2 into our atmosphere whilst we move 3,600 farmers off the land. And that's all because of our greed. It's all because of our desire for aesthetically perfect-looking produce, imported foods, meat products, and our incessant demand for choice that we want available to us 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. Not only do we have a food obsession that's gone too far, but we have a food obsession that is killing us. It is killing our planet, and it is killing Australian livelihoods. Tonight, hiding in agony are the silent victims of our food obsession and industry's relentless desire to research, create, develop, market, exploit and profiteer from that obsession. Australia has one of the highest rates of obesity in the world. Obesity, heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes and diet-related cancers cost this country nearly $60 billion a year. Diet-related chronic disease is our #1 cause of preventable death. And if current trends continue, by 2025 we'll have 83% of men and 75% of women who will be overweight or obese. And our children are the first generation predicted to not live as long as we do. As of last year, there are twice the number of obese or overweight people as there are hungry in the world. So this is too important a topic to get distracted with the semantics of what real food is. We're not debating that. We're debating our food obsession has gone too far, and for that purpose we must define food as the majority of Australians see it and as the law defines it. We can't define it as the elite minority who get to eat in fine dining restaurants, swan around the globe and look at exotic foods, and who can purchase boutique fare or have enough land to grow their own. It would actually be incredibly irresponsible to send this message, that no, our food obsession hasn't gone too far. It would be irresponsible to the 1,500 people who will die next month from a diet-related disease, because I'm afraid they don't actually have the time to have an intellectual debate about the definition of real food, especially when the law, society and the food industry tell them they are dying from eating food. You know, when my grandmother was young, the foods that we consume every day were luxury foods. They were absolute treats and they were really expensive. You know, meat, chocolates, desserts, cakes, they were often homemade. That was a time when recipe books were a scribble on the back of an envelope of your neighbour's recipe, a Fuji apple hadn't even been invented, and diet-related disease was nothing like it is today. You see, our grandparents had a relationship with food. We're the ones with the obsession. Unfortunately, we can't go back to those times. We live in a world where maltodextrin, sodium citrate, xanthan gum are all ingredients in a fruit roll-up marketed to your children for their lunchboxes. And we put them in our children's lunchboxes by the tens of thousands because we want convenient. You might like to know that those ingredients are also found in cigarettes. In fact, 17,000 new products will flood our shelves this year. And in direct contrast, there's an alarming amount of people that are suffering from food insecurity, and that is not having regular access to appropriate, nutritious food for a healthy, active lifestyle. 1 million kids tomorrow morning are going to school on an empty belly that's got no nutritious food in it. And I quote from a letter that was written to me. Being on a pension, you don't get much after you've paid your bills out for a fortnight. Now and again, I save up for something special, like a huge bowl of fruit. Our food system is broken. It is inequitable. It is our unquenchable desire for convenience processed food and perfect-looking food that widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots. We demand straight carrots. We want pink lady apples that are just the right Pantone of pink. And now we want mutant lettuces that produce 3 varieties on 1 root bowl. Well, Mother Nature just doesn't provide standardised food like that. So all of the food that is too small, too large, not quite right, is left in the ground to rot. 4 million tonnes of it. $7.8 billion. That is enough to feed 29 million people 3 meals a day, every day of the year. You know, if we would just accept what nature produces and eat food as nature intended it, if we rejoiced in what is produced in this country, we could solve Australia's food poverty tomorrow. Farmers are increasingly forced to sell their farms to the bigger producers who can actually absorb this waste and provide the exacting standards we are demanding. And in return for dumping all of this fresh food, what do we get? We get methane, 25 times more deadly than your car exhaust emits. Fresh food in landfill is the second largest contributor, pipped only at the post by livestock, another Western obsession. In fact, livestock contributes 50% more methane than all of the cars, trucks, automobiles, planes and ships put together. In developing countries, rural farmers are toiling the land to sell grain to the West while their children stand malnourished beside them. And what do we do with this grain? We feed it to our cattle so we can have a burger. You know, it takes 16,000 litres of water to produce just 1 kilo of beef. A quarter of the water that we use this year will go to make the 1 billion tonnes of food that no one will eat. We are eating into our Earth's capital at an unprecedented rate, chewing through Mother Nature's resources, and she cannot replenish them. You know what? If the whole world lived like Australians, we'd need 4 planet Earths to sustain us. We've got 1. Mahatma Gandhi said this: Earth has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. So every time you reject a piece of fruit or vegetables because of its appearance, every time you select an imported item over Australian, or you stop at the fast food outlet just for convenience, you are the ones that are contributing to that hungry child's cry, to the farmer's plea for please just one more month on my land, and to this planet's utter despair. Because obsession, it doesn't respect, it doesn't revere, regard, care, or love. It simply consumes. So put down your knives and forks. Let's turn off those reality TV shows. Let's just stop for a minute and go out to our gardens and listen. Because that is the sound of the earth breathing. You must vote tonight that our food obsession has gone too far before we eat ourselves and our planet to death. Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here this evening, having a wonderful rational debate about food. Thank you for coming in this evening. I would like to address the topic, our food obsession has gone too far. Look, I'm a farm boy turned food writer, and I go around the world and around the nation, and I write about people and who grow food and where it comes from and how it's enjoyed and how they prepare it in a cultural context. And I can honestly say to you that we do not have an obsession with food. We do not have one. In this country, however, I want to show you a true obsession. We have an obsession with sport. Where else in the world do they shut down the government and shut down the economy for a horse race? You know, and when one of our great horse races dies, we don't mince it as they would do in another country. No, we stuff them and put them in a glass case. The Far Lap is our horsey version of Lenin's tomb. Look, Far Lap was born in New Zealand, but we call him an Australian national hero. Look, we don't even do that to humans, let alone Richard Wilkins. Someone said the other day, what's the best thing about celebrity chefs? To which the reply was, they take the pressure off real celebrities. What I want to do now is look at some of our real chefs. Okay, who here knows about the Culinary Olympics in Germany last year, where Australian chefs came 9th in the world? Silence. Didn't even make the papers. Whereas when our Olympic team makes 10th, they get a ticker tape parade. Now that is obsessive. We don't have an obsession with food. And if our national debate is anything to go by, we don't have an obsession with food, because at present the federal government is formulating the National Food Plan that will radically change food production and food regulation in Australia. And they are wholeheartedly, according to the Green Paper that's just been released, or last year, they wholeheartedly support GM technology, nanotechnology. But it didn't get much of a say in the in debate and national discussion. What we were really was distracted with, look over here, quick, look, there's some prostitutes and some cab chargers. What we are obsessed with in our national debate, when the most important thing that has been discussed is how we grow our food to feed ourselves. When that has been discussed, the national debate is about pedophile priests, billionaire mining magnates, and the fear of asylum seekers. You know, people talk about fad restaurants. You know, they talk about the places where they talk about restaurants where where the restaurants don't take bookings and people stand in queues. They're actually called McDonald's. Tonight, around Melbourne, there'll be 100, 200 people or so standing in these no reservations restaurants, the trendy ones I'm referring to now. But at the same time, tonight, the number of people lined up in front of stainless steel cash registers owned by American hamburger companies, 700,000 tonight. Do you know how many people eat at McDonald's every day? 1.2 million people. And in the context of tonight's discussion and the premise, I would argue what they're eating is not food. Because this is not a good situation we're in. And if we're truly obsessed by food, we would never allow this to happen to begin with. And for the record, those who constantly eat at those places do not have an obsession with food, they have an obsession with eating. Now, let's get down to the elephant in the room. Play a thing called MasterChef. It's a television show, you may or may not have heard of it. It's a television show produced by Rupert Murdoch's News Limited Corporation, production company for a station part owned by his son Lachlan and Gina Reinhardt. Oh, mining magnate, sorry. Now, MasterChef, when you scrounge around and pull in the figures for the last series, from every corner of the nation, it rates about 650,000. So 19 out of 20 Australians did not watch MasterChef. And that's less than a number of people standing in line for burgers tonight. The other cooking-based format, My Kitchen Rules, which the great majority of the population still don't watch, like MasterChef, it's a reality program that's based around people's journeys. And so when you hear someone say, "My souffle deflated," the story is not about technique. It's not about the food. It's about the human emotion associated with failure under pressure. Do not get the two confused. Camera 3 zoom into the girl crying with a flower on her face and the tears in her eyes. Nice. And for the majority of the people who don't watch My Kitchen Rules, it somehow morphed into this bizarre pan-ethnic bitch slap, jumping the shark and pushing into a new genre of TV. I like to call it surreality TV, but I don't advise you to watch it. So look, on the sheer evidence of the numbers, we don't have an obsession with food television, but I make the argument these programs are not about food, they're actually about drama. And to say these programs are about food is like describing Downton Abbey as being a documentary about housekeeping. Now, what I do propose, however, is that we need to be obsessed with food and where it comes from. Because if we don't, and we continue to live in ignorant bliss and continue to salivate like Pavlov's dog every time the supermarket rings the $10 a kilo rump steak bell, our food system will go further and further down the road to chemical, mechanical and unethical animal husbandry that place unreasonable demands on the workforce, a greater load on the land and demean those who have to treat animals, and by extension, us as a society. So we need to be obsessed enough with food to be able to see that we eat too much meat to maintain a healthy diet and a healthy planet. We need to be obsessed to reject the oranges that come from the USA that sit on the supermarket shelves, while farmers up in Mildura are ripping out oranges and orange trees as we speak. We need to be obsessed to write to our politicians about the obscenity when stone fruit farmers knock fresh, ripe fruit off stone fruit trees because the cost of labour in South African orchards and canning companies is less than it is here. We need to be obsessed with food to stop this bizarre situation when buying $1 a litre milk forces farmers to sell their cows and walk off the land because the cost of producing that litre of milk is more than they're getting paid for it. The end game, and has already started, is that we lose our farmers and our food is flown in and shipped in from nations around the globe with cheaper labour costs, lower working conditions and worse environmental laws. Has our food obsession gone too far? It hasn't even started. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The topic is, has our obsession with food gone too far? And oh, yeah, yes, it has. Last night on my Twitter feed on my iPhone, I saw a message that read, truffle-infused oil, local wild porcini ravioli, microgreens, salted caramel and buffalo milk ice cream, orgasmic. I put down my salada and coon tasty and I read it again. Many questions came to mind, of course, but the one I was most interested in was how anyone could tweet while having an orgasm and spell truffle-infused oil correctly. When I'm in the throes of passion, the first thing that goes is my ability to type, let alone spell. I imagine most of my tweets would be vowel sounds. Listen, could you stop this bullshit of sending pictures of your tea to everyone? It's a pain in the arse. It's weird. On Facebook, everyone sends the pictures of their dinner, their lunch. And by the way, on Twitter, your succulent ravioli doesn't look appetising. It looks like a couple of old limp bath mats sprinkled with hedge clippings. As for me being turned on by getting a picture of your food, I mean, I didn't savour the smell of it cooking. I can't eat it, I can't lick my fingers afterwards, so please do not feel the need to share. Keep your food porn to yourself. Some of us are trying to have actual sex. So dropping my iPhone and picking up my dessert course of Ferrero Rocher, or should I say my Tuesday evening on a plate, I had to reflect on our obsession with food and just how our healthy appetites have become so pornographic. How did a simple roast chook and veggies at Sunday lunch after church become a trussed and stuffed 3-layer turkducken that's been viewed on YouTube 500,000 times? We have become obsessed about food, and in the most mindless, superficial way. The illicit blog addresses get passed around, the pictures of Hugh Fernley Whittingstall's pork belly. Well, you know, some of us have been eating Mr. Hines baked beans for years and we're perfectly satisfied, if you don't mind. We're not about to have it off with Hugh's rare breed of pork. Now, the term gastroporn, you may or may not know, is said to have been first coined in 2005 in a magazine article in Harper's Magazine entitled Debbie Does Salad by the culture writer Frederick Kaufman. Now, in this article, he meets a woman who was a real X-rated porn industry photographer, and now she's switched to food. If you like, she's swapped snapping appendages for appetisers. Or she used to photograph wieners and now she photographs, anyway, whatever. So she talks in this article about how food porn works. How do those shots of a ripe strawberry push between plump red lips? How does that work? Well, she says it's a beautifully idealised world. The spread chicken on the chopping board is what she calls the pussy shot. And finally, when it's cooked and devoured on screen, the editor zooms in on wet lips and rapt faces as they chew and they swallow and chew and swallow again. And by the way, it's exactly the same technique used for flogging chicken nuggets to 6-year-old kids. It's classic porn style, says the photographer. They're stretching the moment out, the orgasmic moment, and running it in an endless loop. Come on down, Nigella, and lick that spoon, baby. Now, I'm not saying Nigella Lawson's porn. Far from it. She's the foodie's PJ-rated romp, a bit like Carry On Up the Croquembouche. My 13-year-old daughter squeals with laughter when she watches Nigella, bite into a succulent beef thin sourdough slathered with mayo and winks and grins and wipes her chin. And my daughter says, "Oh, it's a steak sandwich. Get a room, lady." Of course, compared with Nigella, my kitchen rules as your parents on a Friday night in the missionary position. And in MasterChef, they're pervs. They mostly like to watch. But millions of Australians every night sit down for their big fat helping of food porn. Beautifully lit, the music comes up, pushing food into their mouths. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I'm old enough to remember when there was no such thing as food porn. Trawling back through the photographic record of my life, I can barely find one thing vaguely edible in any photograph except for the time we went to visit the Big Pineapple. That is about it. There was no such thing as food porn in the mid-80s during the Bob Geldof Feed the World years, because foodies weren't even a species then. You couldn't really dribble on about gastro porn when television footage of millions of Africans starving was obscenity enough. And it's difficult to make a bowl of uni-mix protein porridge in a refugee camp look erotic. I've never really been able to make that leap to see food as part of my sex life. Oh, not counting when we were teenagers and we made X-rated banana splits at samba parties, of course. And to be truly erotic, in my opinion, food must be used as a sex toy. And for my money, you just can't go past whipped cream in a can and glacé cherries. Now, I'm not saying that aphrodisiacs suck, if only. Because you can lick and suck and savour an oyster, but that little delicious morsel can't lick and suck you back. I've tried to be turned on by food porn. I've given it a red-hot go. There was a picture of some Moroccan fresh figs, with pears, and I was looking at the droplets of juice caught in the translucent, fragrant droplet. Nah, it still looked like a bowl of fruit. Still, in one way, you really have to admire foodies when the difference between a boring Saturday night alone and an evening of mind-blowing erotic adventure is a backlit picture of a char-grilled eggplant. You got it made, really, haven't you? So you can't have sex with an eggplant. How about sex with a chef? They all look rootable enough. Matthew. Gorgeous. Except for Heston Blumenthal, who looks more like a knee surgeon, if you ask me. But in real life, who can get past the aprons thick with 50 kinds of unmentionable grot and those appalling check pants? I mean, even golfers dress sexier, for fuck's sake. And I'm sorry, the smell. See, this is about the thing about pornography too. I mean, you can't smell. Food is not pornography. It's a stupid, ridiculous, vacuous obsession. It's gone too far. We know it. And in just the same way that porno addicts find that they're no longer turned on by their wives and partners and husbands, food porn addicts, unless they're dining at Heston's The Fat Duck, everything else tastes like cardboard to them. Our obsession with food porn is dumb. Stephanie Alexander is not some sort of gastronomic Larry Flint. People don't stash their Jill Duplay in the bottom of the sock drawer when the babysitter comes over. If food was that sexy, you'd be able to ring a 0055 line where you could pay a bloke to read you a souffle recipe in a husky voice. Ladies and gentlemen, the more we become obsessed by food, the more we lose our taste. And how do we reclaim what food really is? By understanding that food is about love, not sex. A gravy dish of kindness, a gravy boat full to the brim with compassion, a sauce bottle overflowing with sacrifice. Not by sending a grainy Instagram of a serve of buffalo milk ice cream and shouting, nom, 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 orgasm. In conclusion, conclusion, our obsession with food has gone too far. See, it's all about instant gratification these days, isn't it? No foreplay of peeling the carrot or deep hitting the peach. These days, it's straight to the money shot and then reach out and dial dominoes. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here in Melbourne and to dip into your so-called obsessive foodie culture. But if you think Australians are obsessed with food, you should see the Chinese. I've spent much of the last couple of decades exploring China and its amazing cuisines. And one of the most striking things about the country is that it's a nation infatuated by food. The Chinese know better perhaps than anyone else that there are few things more important than food. It isn't just fuel, it's the foundation of health and happiness. We don't just need to eat, we need to eat well. Poor diet is at the root of much ill health. As the Chinese say, 病从口入, sickness enters through the mouth. And it's not just about physical health, because there's plenty of evidence that diet shapes our mental well-being too. Science has shown that improvements in diet can raise the IQ of school children and reduce aggressive behaviour in prisons. Okay, you can say, but that's no reason to be infatuated with it, to talk about it all the time, to spend all our time thinking about the next meal, to watch people cooking on television. Why can't we just stop making such a fuss and just go home and quietly rustle up something for supper? But let's be realistic here. Of course, in the good old days, we all learnt to cook from our mothers and grandmothers, feeding our families with something instinctive. It just happened without all this ridiculous fanfare. But these days, the chain of teaching and experience is broken, and many people have just forgotten how to cook. How do we remind them? Well, there are many possibilities, but the mass media is one. And while some people may simply slaver over Nigella Lawson on TV and never actually cook, others will be encouraged to take their first steps in the kitchen. And as the Chinese know very well, food culture isn't something binary. It's not either about basic sustenance or about fun and frivolity. It's not about celebrity chefs or sensible home cooking. They can exist simultaneously. In China, food's always been a very serious business. In ancient times, making edible offerings to gods and ancestors was the most important ritual of the Chinese state. And now, as in the past, food is the glue that keeps personal and business relationships together. It's both sustenance and medicine. But it's also one of the great joys of life, full of fun and playfulness and a national obsession. I would argue that joy and enthusiasm, which is often what we really mean when we talk about an obsession with food, are inherently good things. There's something puritanical about this idea that enjoying food and being passionate about it is decadent, silly, and corrupting. Perhaps it has its roots in the thinking of medieval Christian ascetics, who defined gluttony not just as overeating, but also as eating too eagerly or too daintily. But why this prejudice against eager and dainty eating? I suggest to you that pleasure and frivolity are not only harmless, but are vital parts of a healthy food culture, that gastronomy is not decadent, but more valuable than the Puritans amongst you seem to think. Of course, no one in their right mind would suggest that you should eat a 20-course tasting menu of molecular gastronomy every night, but why can't it be part of a rich and diverse food culture? I want to take as an example a typical Chinese gourmet. Here we have someone who thinks and talks about food incessantly, who's willing to spend a significant proportion of his income on food, who likes her food to be aesthetically pleasing with an attractive balance of colours in the dishes at every meal, who wants to know where his food comes from, who seeks out interesting and exotic ingredients, who takes enormous pleasure in the textures or kogan, mouthfeel, of whatever she eats, who seeks to adapt his diet to the climate, weather, and her general state of health, and who is crazy when it comes to food about the next big thing. And I'm not talking about a member of some extreme elite here, because an appreciation of gastronomy is something that runs from the top of Chinese society right to the bottom. So why do I think the Chinese, as obsessed as they are, have got it right? Well, firstly, because people who care passionately about food will make the right sort of food choices for themselves and their families. They are the ones who seek out ingredients that are fresh and wholesome. They're the ones who are willing to pay more for good food that's produced in a sustainable and ethical manner. They're the ones calling to account corporations that want to line their pockets by feeding us rubbish. And although some people dismiss a preference for organic produce as a fussy middle-class phenomenon, it's not just about personal fastidiousness. It's a statement of support for an approach to agriculture that supports biodiversity and the renewal of the soil. And not just about biodiversity either. It's about encouraging the survival of culinary diversity as a resource for future generations. Secondly, people who, to borrow from those medieval ascetic saints, eat eagerly and daintily, seeking out food that's interesting, varied, and aesthetically pleasing, well, they're the ones with the most nutritionally complete diets. It's fairly well known that vegetables with different colours contain different nutrients. So leafy greens are rich in certain minerals and vitamins, tomatoes are red because of lycopene, which has a role in preventing cancer, and so on. Eating a rainbow of exciting and aesthetically pleasing ingredients, like the Chinese gourmet, helps to ensure that one has a balanced diet. And thirdly, the immense pleasure the Chinese take in the textures of their foods encourages them to make the most of their ingredients and minimise waste. In China, every part of fish, beast or fowl has its culinary uses. Almost nothing is thrown away. The head of a fish is prized for its silky and voluptuous textures, pigs' trotters for their gelatinous skin and crunchy cartilage. And the old Chinese obsession with food has led people there over the centuries to amass a remarkable body of information about the culinary and medicinal properties of all the ingredients within their shores. In good times, exotic plants and unusual creatures may be eaten for pleasure by the rich and powerful, but in bad times they've formed a defence against famine for the poor, a matter of life and death. Gastronomy and survival are sometimes two sides of the same coin. And finally, fashions in food and the quest for novelty might seem most frivolous of all, but these, I argue, are more valuable than they might at first seem, because it's invention and artistry that have enabled the survival and development of the human race. There's compelling evidence that it was the invention of cooking that allowed our ancestors to absorb nutrition sufficient to grow our brains and make us clever. Much later, it was the innovations of fermentation and tofu making that unlocked the amazingly valuable proteins in the soybean, with far-reaching consequences for the Chinese and others. Perhaps the experiments of today's avant-garde chefs, spurred on by the enthusiasm of a general public waking up to the pleasures of food, will lead to new advances that benefit us all. In the future, we will need to experiment relentlessly if we are to feed a growing human population faced by the challenges of environmental degradation and climate change. Probably within our lifetimes, we will have to be more agile and resourceful in our diets to accommodate the depletion of natural resources like certain kinds of fish and the necessity of eating less meat. In Jarrett Diamond's amazing book Collapse, about why societies choose to fail or survive, he wrote about the small precarious colony of Vikings who lived in Greenland about 1,000 years ago. They insisted on eating their traditional beef, although cattle farming was unsustainable in the local environment. And they refused to eat seal like the native people, which is one of the reasons why they ended up starving to death. I put it to you that societies with rich, varied, and adventurous food cultures are healthy societies. And in order to survive in the future, we will need to be like the Chinese, who can make delicacies out of grasshoppers and goose intestines. We will need to be like the Chinese, with their wonderful ability to find gastronomic sustenance and pleasure in the most unlikely places. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to be more obsessed with food for the sake of our health, happiness, and future survival. Our food obsession in the West has not gone far enough. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, just let me remind you, if you'd like to tweet something about the argument or even begin your first line of gastro-porn, the tweeting title is #IQ2OZ, IQ2Oz. At the end of tonight, you'll be asked to vote, so I just remind you to keep hold of your voting tickets. But before we get to that point, we could just bring up the lights. There's an opportunity now, if you'd like to speak in this debate. Now, the microphones are usually just there. You can see somebody there, and there should be one coming up at this point. You'll have an opportunity, you might want to speak for the motion, against the motion, just make a comment or ask a question. We'll take as many people as might want to have to speak, otherwise we'll move quickly towards the summaries. So does anybody want to ask a question or make a comment about the arguments they've heard so far?
Brian Bailey, I'd like to ask a question to the leaders of both sides. In Melbourne here, when we reject tap water and choose bottled water, is that a sign of our obsession with food?
Oh, thank you. What I'm going to do is collect these and then pass them around. So if a city has got to the point where it's not drinking tap water but wanting it from the bottle, is that a mark of obsession? We'll come back to that. Yes, microphone here on the right-hand side. Your name, please.
My name is Alice. I'd just like to pose a question for Katy on the affirmative side. So I really liked your comment in which you said that our grandparents had more of a relationship with food rather than an obsession. And to me, the only difference between what they were experiencing and what we're experiencing is that we're just a lot bigger. However, I think that the obesity crisis can't only be due to Australia's obsession with food. And in fact, I believe that the way in which we as a nation will solve it is by prioritising, essentially first and foremostly by educating people like me, like students. And would it not be more productive for me to swing past Coles before school and buy a $5 salad and then go home and study hard to find a long-term solution, rather than trying to stop people going to Macca's tomorrow night for dinner?
Okay. So if I'm taking it, it's a question about the benefit of education for another generation over trying to change the behaviour of those who are already adults. Is that it?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. Over here to this microphone.
Hi, my name's Natasha. I just wanted to say that I'm really disappointed to hear the focus on the word obsession and not on the word our. And that really comes across with, either side. You've got one side talking about generalised sort of populations, whether they be Chinese or French, and referring to an entire country as if it was just one person in comparison to the focus on, the difference between people who obviously have enough money to choose what they can eat in comparison to those who really don't. So I just wanted to say it's a real disappointment that hasn't been focused on as much as the word obsession.
So can I just ask before you go, if they had talked about our, what would they have been talking about more clearly in your mind?
Well, some speakers deliberately, when they came up to the microphone, said, I think it was Matthew at the beginning, who said, by our, we're talking about, the Western world, or the English-speaking Western world, I believed he said. And then there were references to the sort of differences in terms of, I've forgotten the lady's name, with the blonde hair. I loved your speech, by the way. Yeah. But that comparison of, sort of people who can't choose and who go hungry in comparison to those who don't. So our was a bit obscure.
So if I was to reframe it as a question, would you say, is there something special about the Western world or Australia's obsession which should be distinguished between those in other countries? Is that right?
I think it probably should have just been a bit clearer.
Okay, right. Okay, we've got a number of things there to respond to. Who wants to go first? There's a question about the use of the word our. There's an issue about whether or not it would be better to focus on educating younger people rather than trying to change the settled habits of older people. And the first question as well.
I'm happy to respond to the question about education, because I wholeheartedly believe in education. In fact, when we started SecondBite, the first thing that we did was actually go out there and collect and redistribute fresh food to people. And working in tandem with that was education pieces about how to give people the tools to create long-term nutritious meals, or to have long-term preventative solutions to food insecurity, by actually deploying programs that taught people to make meals for their family in their homes. So I wholeheartedly support the idea of education. However, I do think it's a very important message that our food obsession has gone too far, and that was the point we were debating tonight. And food, whether I agree with it or not, is legally defined as some of that rubbish that I talked about in my speech. And if you go to Alla's restaurant, which is absolutely beautiful in in Dalesford, but you go 40 kilometres down the road, there are a lot of other restaurants, and I use the term loosely, and if you walked in there and spoke to people who are eating in tables that turn over once every 10 minutes, they would tell you they're eating food. They wouldn't say, I'm eating highly processed, high fat, high sugar. So I do believe we need to educate. We've tried putting kilojoules on all of those products. It has not stopped profit one bit. So I think education is important, but let's just try and get some of that obsession for food off the menu first to allow us the space to do a better job.
Richard, the first gentleman asked about bottled water, and surely for your side, the notion that people are rejecting perfectly good tap water in favour of bottled water is emblematic of an obsession, wouldn't you say?
No, obsession with water. No,
With
it's
water.
obsession with convenience, yes. It's stupid. I think it's, yes, I agree with you, sir. It is a very silly thing to do, to spend $3.20 on a cold bottle of water when it costs you nothing to get, or 0.001 cents to get out of the tap, yes. Yeah, but I don't think it's part of the discussion this evening. What Alla and I were thinking about, we had a discussion before this. It was about how do we define this topic? How do we define this topic because it's so broad? It's not like a meat versus vegetarian topic. So we do have to work out some of the nomenclature. In our discussion, we were talking about, okay, what is food, what is eating? And this is where Katy and we differ, is that it is the obsession with eating as opposed to food, because we're seeing this in a global context and discussion of a pendular swing against foodism or foodies. And this is where the premise of the discussion came this evening, a book from Stephen Poole.
What do you say to Katy? Katy challenged you and said, look, don't try and define out the high starch, high sugar, high fat, and just say, well, everything that bad isn't food. She wants you to say, that's food too for the people who are eating, isn't it?
I think that most of that obsessiveness is actually not about obsessiveness with the product. It's obsessiveness with the sideline, with convenience, with celebrity, with frou-frou, with all of the other things have become attached to the issue of food. It's not about concern about food. In a culture that is truly concerned about food, none of these terrible things would be happening. We wouldn't have GMOs.
Then that you would be agreeing with us, correct?
Well, I think
that the obsession has gone too far.
Actually,
that it actually is not so much about infinite care and loving nurture, that it has actually gone to vacuous obsession.
Wendy, I think, look, I loved your presentation, but I just want to say that mindless and puerile food porn and the love of mindless and puerile food porn does not an obsession make. It does not make an obsession with food. I mean, our definition of people who are obsessed with food are people who are concerned enough to create a situation where we resist the industrial food system of the US. We resist the US model. We follow cultures with strong, long-term food cultures.
Okay,
that's our argument.
I'll take one more comment from the panel, which will be from Fuchsia, then back to the floor. Fuchsia, a brief comment?
Yeah, I just think it's a real mistake to somehow blame the culture of gastronomy and pleasure in food on the crisis that we're all facing with food and public health, which no one would possibly deny. One is not the cause of the other, and it is possible to have good public health and a culture of gastronomy. And I would argue that China is a case in point, that they've had a very, very refined and sophisticated culture of gastronomy at the elite levels, but also, you know, Western observers of China throughout the ages have been remarkably struck by how well the ordinary people were eating.
Well, to take that young woman's last comment, though, do you think that talking of what is distinctive of Chinese culture can be transferred into such a distinctively different culture as exists in the West?
No, but I think you can look at it as an example of a place with a healthy food culture, of which one can say obsession is a part.
Okay.
But it coexists with a wonderful tradition of healthy home cooking, of balance, and of good food for ordinary people.
Okay, back to the floor. We won't say your name, sir.
Vic Say, and I would like to thank Fuchsia Dunlop for an extraordinary performance which only goes to prove that our food obsession has gone too far. She herself wrote a book, I think you said, sir, about shark's fin and something or other. How many sharks bleed slowly to death after being cut, having their fins cut off, madam, and the rest of the animal thrown away? You said the Chinese, sophisticated and wonderful, eat every bit of everything they kill. These sharks slowly bleed to death, and the poor tigers left without a penis. Never mind about the rest of the tiger, but the penis must be eaten by some Chinese somewhere. And the rhinoceros's horn, let's eat that too, so we can have better sex for longer. It'll be wonderful, but I think you defeat your own argument. We have become too obsessed.
Right, thank you.
The first thing to say is that shark's fin has been a delicacy in China for hundreds of years. And in the past, it was a very rare delicacy that very few people would ever have the chance to eat. What's happened now with China's economic boom is that lots of people who've become rich suddenly want to emulate the grandiose habits of the Cantonese rich of the past and eat shark's fin. And that's why we have this grotesque crisis of extermination of sharks for their fins, which of course I wouldn't defend at all. But I do think it's important when Westerners condemn the Chinese for eating shark's fin to recognize that all of us are guilty of atrocious crimes against the environment. Probably most of us who eat fish are eating fish that are gathered by extremely destructive fishing practices, which are driving to extinction many species. A lot of sharks die as bycatch in trawler fishing anyway. And if you think about the consequences of our boundless appetite for beef in terms of, water shortages, in terms of destroying rainforests to grow grain to feed to our cows, that I think it's a mistake for Westerners to get too sanctimonious with the Chinese. We're all in it together. We're all doing terrible things.
But do you see a connection, as the gentleman suggests, between the obsession within China for food, which you described, and, for example, shark's fin or the tiger's penis or any of the more exotic foods which they might consume?
The tiger's penis thing, the Chinese medicine, the desire for obscure folk remedies is slightly separate from what we're talking about this evening. But I think the quest for exotica in Chinese gastronomy is something that now has pernicious consequences. But it also has very good effects, which is that the Chinese use everything. They are able, I think it's either the EU or the UN who's suggesting we're all going to have to eat insects because they're a sustainable way of producing protein. So.
Okay, down here, this microphone.
You failed to make a connection with the native man and his observance of the food that he has to cultivate. Well, not cultivate, but observe and not destroy, because he knows where his next meal's coming from, whereas urban man has become the next evolution of mankind, and we have no idea where our food comes from. Native man was taught by his parents, so the education was there. Even the orangutan takes 7 years to train the orangutan how to navigate the jungle. So our urban man is actually growing exponentially, and food has to be produced to meet our needs at any cost. And the obsession with food production is probably even worse than the consumption of. But could you make some comment there about the fact that native man somehow had an intrinsic sort of control, whereas urban man with his pet dogs, all those sort of things, are just consuming the planet at a rate will imitate the Easter Islanders, and the last thing we'll have to eat will be each other.
Question about urbanisation we'll come to. We're going to take two last comments and then move back to the panel. Yes.
Yes, I'm Hans Speer, and Fuchsia, my comment is directed to you. While I agreed with much of what you said, I fear that perhaps you are romanticizing what's going on in China, including with food. I visited China in 2007, and I came away feeling that China is adopting many of the worst mistakes of the West. And that includes in terms of what it's doing with food, because obesity is a growing problem in China. Many of the Chinese are adopting fast foods like McDonald's. On top of that, the Chinese, particularly the new middle classes, are adopting automobiles, and bicycles are going increasingly out of fashion. In fact, the Chinese government is pushing them out of the way. And one of the things that has kept the Chinese generally fairly slender is not only their food eating habits, but the use of bicycles and exercise. And with the adoption of the motor vehicle, it's becoming a problem.
Thank you. We've got a point about romanticisation, the move to fast foods and the swap from bicycles to automobiles. We'll be coming to Fuchsia in a moment, so we'll just take this last comment.
Just an observation from a food conference in 1991 where Margaret Visser gave the keynote address. Now, she was probably the only non-obsessed foodie at the conference. I was there, so I was obsessed. Her comment came down to a dichotomy between people who want new things and new foods, and people who are afraid of new food and want old things and old food. And I think this is our obsession. Our obsession, certainly here in this country, is on new things and new food and learning about it, connoisseurship, that sort of thing. The other comment I'd like to make is, sorry, Alla, I stopped counting the word best after 37 when your talk. And that's what we want. We want best, best, best. We can't appreciate what is here now in terms of obsession. And just to finish, I'd just like to have what she's having.
He wants to have what you're having, Katy. There's something that you've obviously been having which has been very impressive. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to ask you to do in just a moment is that the speakers are going to start 2 minutes each to sum up. I'm going to ask Fuchsia if you can include in your remarks a response to the question about China that was put to you. If somebody can pick up the issue about urbanisation and the difference between modern man versus older as you go through. We'll go in reverse order, so it'll start off with Fuchsia, then it'll be Wendy and so forth. While they're summing up, you'll see that ballot boxes will be passed to you. And let me remind, if you are undecided, and I hope you're not, leave the for and against form still joined together. Otherwise, tear it and put for or against. And the sort of question you're asking yourself perhaps is, do I buy the argument of the negative that when you're talking about food, you're only talking about the good stuff, and therefore the obsession has to go much further? Or do you buy the argument that Katy was putting before, that we need to be realistic and that food for people is whatever they happen to be eating, and that obsession has gone too far? Fuchsia Dunlop, your 2 minutes begin now.
Firstly, Chinese going from bikes to cars, catastrophe for the world, but they just want to live as well as we do, and I think that's understandable. Chinese and bad Western food habits, absolutely. The younger generation in China are being seduced by the fast food and junk in the same way that the children of the West have been for a long time. They're facing rocketing rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, etc. So this is very bad news, but my hope is that China has this extraordinary culture of eating for health, a very rich resource to draw on. And I hope that as the Chinese become more confident in their own culture and less sort of enrolled in the idea that the West is always about progress, including with food, that they'll rediscover with pride their own traditions and actually have something to teach us. So I completely agree with you about the bad way that things are going, but I would hope that the Chinese have a greater basis to renew their food culture than we do. Summing up in general, if you're going to be obsessed about anything, I think let it be food, because it's so important and pleasurable. Secondly, I said this before, the terrible health crisis we're all facing can't be blamed on the obsession with food. And indeed, in the mess we're in, the interest in food and pleasure in food offers one of the ways out. And finally, I think that you'll find that a lot of the so-called food obsessives are actually at the cutting edge of activism for sustainable food production, for equitable food distribution, for education in schools. So don't blame them, they're part of the solution.
Thank you. Wendy Harmer.
Yes, well, as was mentioned, 1 in every 4 books in Australia is a cookbook. And what I believe these days, in the old days they used to be instruction manuals, now they have become cheap gastro porn. And really we have, as I say, I think lost touch with the loving aspect of food and become more interested in sensation and image than we have with what real food is. And I'd just like to quickly finish by comparing two things. I saw an online post that reviewed a picture of a slice of artichoke frittata. And it said, "Here we are attracted by the tempting display of its insides, like Sharon Stone's furtive but confident flash in Basic Instinct. The frittata slice is pulled away a little. It gives, but not too much. It flirts with us. It seduces us. It makes us really, really want an artichoke frittata." And I compare that with, I guess, Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. No pictures, no click-through for the recipe, no pop-up ad for Gravox or a celebrity chef, just the memory that came from a little crumb of Madeleine cake that awakens exquisite pleasure and all-powerful joy, and just a little snippet from that. And when from a long distant past nothing subsists, after the smell, after the people are dead, after things are broken and scattered, taste and smell alone, more fragile, but more enduring, more unsubstantial, more persistent, more faithful, remain poised for a long time. So that is my point, that we have become too obsessed with image over substance.
Richard Cornish.
Lovely. I just wanted to probably make a comment on what you just said, Wendy, that I think there is a difference between food porn and food, just as, well, last time I looked, there is a difference between porn and sex. Something to think about. I accepted the invitation to come here tonight because, win or lose, I'm in a great position to talk to people, be broadcast on ABC, because food is the single most important subject to talk about, because it what makes civilization stable. We knew the spring uprisings were happening in the Middle East when taxi drivers here were telling us about what was going home. There wasn't enough wheat at the right price, not enough oil to make bread and to cook food in. And the precursor to the rapid change in the Middle East was a food shortage. Now, multiply that around the world and it's chaos. Unless we get our food in order, we don't have a civilization. That's why I was here tonight, just to pass that on. Thank you.
Thank you. Katy Barfield.
I would suggest that an obsession with food won't help our farmers or our environment. What we need is an obsession with keeping farmers on their land. We need to find an obsession with keeping our planet whole. And actually obsessing on food is not going to cure our ill health. It won't preserve our Australian farmers and it won't save the planet. That's absolutely ludicrous. And when we come to the gastronomy of it all and all of the beautiful pictures and the amazing creations, I'd just like to point out that most of those are made with about 1/10 of the fruit, the vegetable or the piece of meat, whilst the rest is discarded. And SecondBite can't even pick that up because we're not allowed to. So if there's one thing that I would like the audience to take away tonight, is this food obsession with perfect food, with having the exact cut of meat, when you want it, how you want it, is absolutely killing the planet. It is creating a divide between the haves and the have-nots never seen before. That one example I read was one of probably about 300 letters that we would get every year, telling us about people who simply do not have enough food to eat because of all of that great quality fresh food deemed imperfect is lying on the floor and therefore not in the system for their use. This is really serious business. We've made a lot of jokes about it tonight. That's good. We've got to have a laugh. But the reality is this is far too serious when people are dying and the earth is dying and our livelihoods are dying. So please, vote tonight for us.
Alla Wolf-Tasker.
I'm confused. totally confused. I mean, I'm trying to work out what would happen if we stopped being obsessed with food. Does that mean all of these other things will be solved? I mean, because that's the argument. If we stop being obsessed with food, somehow the farmers are going to get back onto the land and kids are going to be fed properly and we're going to eat properly and the sharks will be saved and everything else will happen. Come on, the only way these things are going to be fixed is if people like you come to these debates and show that they are obsessed and concerned about issues around food. They are obsessed about food. And I just need one more minute. I just need one more minute. Let's say you've got a really beautiful car, it's finely tuned, you've spent a lot of money on it, and you're offered 2 brands of oil for it. This is the no-brand oil, and it's a quarter of the price of most of the oil that's available in the petrol station. And they say, look, we don't know where it comes from, but look, she'll be right, mate. And over here is the branded oil. BP, it's got bells and whistles, it advertises, it rings your bells, they tell you the makers tell you it's the best one for your car. Which one do most of us pick for our fine-tuned, beautiful car that we've saved up for? You know which one. We pick this one, the good one. When we are prepared to put that amount of scrutiny into the food that we put into ourselves, into our families and into our children, that's when I'll believe we have a true food obsession in this country.
Matthew Evans.
Yeah, for me, I think the distinction is between a place that has a healthy food culture and healthy interest in food and a place that has an obsession with food. And I think I've spent a lot of time in China and a lot of time in Italy, a lot of time in France, places that have a very healthy interest in what goes on their plate and in their mouth. But I think Australia's a little bit different. I want to give you an example. It does relate to coffee, but I think that coffee is an analogy for how we treat food as an obsession in Australia. In Italy, you meet someone, you say, you want to go for coffee. You go, you sit and have a quick cup of coffee, a chat, a laugh. If you're on your own, you'll flirt with the barista in the cafe. In Australia, when I travel around, I see it every place I go, people with takeaway cups of coffee. I want you guys to do this as your homework. We obsess about coffee. We talk about it. We arrange to meet people for it. We grab a whole bunch of it to take to work. We carry our takeaway cups of coffee everywhere. We expect it to be made in a cafe with a $4,000 machine and a barista with a bad attitude and overpaid and bad haircut. We take that coffee, we walk outside with the lid on and we drink it through the hole in the top. Now, I want you to do this. You'll never, ever see people do this in Italy. Drink it out through a hole in the top. Do this next time you get a takeaway cup of coffee. Take the lid off before you take one step, because by moving the coffee, you will change the character that barista and that coffee machine and that noisy, bloody grinder in that cafe is designed to do. Take the lid off, take a sip, put the lid back on, drink through the hole in the top. It tastes like you're drinking through a straw. We're obsessed with coffee, we're obsessed with food, but what we miss is the real flavour, the real character of food, the way it's intended to be, the way it's supposed to be. A healthy interest in food is a good thing, an obsession is not.
Right, well, in a moment I'll be able to get the results of the pre-debate poll and then the vote that you just cast. Before I do, just like to thank our partners here in Melbourne, the Wheeler Centre, for working with us to present these debates, to the staff and management of the Melbourne Town Hall, the volunteers who conducted that ballot, which has just been collated, the Mayor, Aldermen and officers of the City of Melbourne, and to our supporters AMP and to the ABC. Before we even get the results, though, could you join with me in thanking our marvellous panel of speakers, Matthew Evans, Katy Barfield, Wendy Harmer, Alla Wolf-Tasker, Richard Cornish and Fuchsia. I wonder if you can get gout from watching MasterChef. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the pre-debate poll results were as follows. For the motion that our food obsession has gone too far was 58%. Against the motion, 25%. And 17% were undecided. There's been quite a big move. Undecided has dropped from 17% to 8%. For the motion is 43%, but moving up from a starting position of 25% in one of the largest swings I've seen, against the motion wins with 49% of the vote. As you leave tonight, a couple of things. Firstly, a minor thing, please take all the paper with you that you found on your seat. It just makes it a bit easier. Secondly, you might wonder how you vote depending on whether you see food as an end in itself or merely as a means to other goods, such as health, happiness, relationships. If you're interested in these debates, the next debate is on a very controversial topic, and it falls around the time of Anzac Day. And the topic is that Anzac Day is more puff than substance. And when we celebrate the pluckery, bravery of the Anzacs and mateship, and some people love that idea and against it, around Anzac Day, it'd be a fascinating conversation to have about that topic. Ladies and gentlemen, the debate tonight at the Melbourne Town Hall was that our food obsession has gone too far. I declare the motion lost. I thank you for tonight and welcome all members of the House thank you for your support.